What would you do if the person you trusted the most, the one closest to your heart, became the very hand that delivered you into the grasp of your enemies? This is the story of a mighty prophet of Allah, Syamun Al-Ghozi, a man blessed with unimaginable strength and honored with a divine mission. Yet his greatest trial did not come from the swords of his enemies, nor from the idols of his people, but from within his own home, a betrayal that shattered his life and turned his legacy into a story of warning, echoing through the ages. Long before the betrayal unfolded, the world of Syamun Al-Ghozi was already one of hardship, resistance, and constant struggle. He was a prophet chosen to stand in the face of tyranny and corruption, tasked with leading his people away from the shadows of false worship and into the light of Tawheed, the worship of Allah alone. The people to whom he was sent were stubborn, rebellious, and deeply entrenched in idolatry. They lived under rulers who thrived on injustice, and they clung to false gods with pride and arrogance. For them, the words of a prophet were not guidance, but a threat to their comfort, their wealth, and their authority. Syamun Al-Ghozi was not an ordinary man. Allah had blessed him with extraordinary strength, a strength that became both his shield and his test. His might was unmatched among men, and stories of his power spread beyond his people. He was capable of feats that left others in awe, and his very presence was enough to intimidate his enemies. But his true strength did not lie in the power of his arms or the firmness of his grip. It lay in the unshakable conviction he carried in his heart, a faith that never faltered even when mocked, threatened, or attacked. When he spoke, his words carried weight, not only because of his authority as a prophet, but because his heart was anchored in truth. He warned his people of the consequences of idolatry, reminded them of the fate of nations that had turned away from Allah, and invited them toward mercy, justice, and submission to their Creator. Yet, with each call he made, the opposition grew louder. His enemies were not only the idol worshippers, but also the leaders whose power he threatened. They plotted, schemed, and searched for a weakness that could bring him down. Still, Syamun stood tall, undeterred, as the storms of opposition gathered around him. He continued to teach, to struggle, to fight for the message he was entrusted with. And though he had enemies in every direction, he had always believed that his home was his sanctuary, a place of safety where betrayal could never reach him. His wife was by his side, sharing his meals, listening to his words, living in the light of his mission. To him, she was not only a companion, but a confidant, someone bound by trust, love, and loyalty. But sometimes the test that breaks a man does not come from the battlefield, nor from the enemies who wear their hatred openly. Sometimes it comes in silence, hidden in the soft words of a trusted voice, the gentle smile of a familiar face. It creeps in slowly, almost invisibly, until the knife is already pressed against the heart. Syamun Al-Ghozi's greatest trial was written not in the spears of his adversaries, but in the weakness of his own home. The story of what happened next has echoed through generations, whispered as a lesson of both tragedy and divine wisdom. A mighty prophet, brought down not by lack of strength, not by faltering faith, but by betrayal so intimate it could only come from the one closest to him. His fall was not the end of his honor, nor the erasure of his mission, but it was a moment that changed everything, turning his life into a lesson for those who would come after him. And so, as we begin to trace the path of his story, we stand at the threshold of both greatness and sorrow, strength and vulnerability, faith and betrayal. It is the story of a man chosen by Allah, blessed beyond measure, yet tested in a way that pierced deeper than the blade of any enemy. This is the story of Prophet Syamun Al-Ghozi, in the betrayal that brought down a mighty prophet. When Syamun Al-Ghozi was chosen by Allah, it was not by chance nor by accident. Every prophet is chosen with precision, destined to fulfill a role that fits into the greater plan of guidance for mankind. Syamun was a man of resilience, not only in his body but in his spirit, and Allah granted him a station among his messengers to guide a people lost in arrogance. His appointment as a prophet was a burden as much as it was an honor, for to be entrusted with divine revelation was to walk a path filled with hostility and sacrifice. Yet within him was a fire that could not be extinguished, a heart that could not be swayed away from the truth no matter how many stood against him. His people were not ignorant in the sense of lacking knowledge. They were deliberate in their defiance. They lived amidst civilizations where idol worship was not only a belief but a lifestyle, a tradition passed down for generations, guarded with pride. Statues made of stone, wood, and gold filled their temples, each crafted with the hands of men, yet worshipped as if they held the power of the heavens. These false gods were adorned with offerings, sacrifices, and rituals, and the leaders ensured the worship continued, for it was through idolatry that they maintained their control. Those in power thrived on keeping the people chained to superstition, enslaved to traditions that fed their wealth and authority. Into this world, Syamun Al-Ghozi was sent, carrying the message that there is no deity worthy of worship but Allah. His task was not simply to speak these words, but to stand as a living example of divine guidance, to challenge centuries of corrupted belief, and to call people towards surrendering themselves to the one who created them. Yet from the very first moment he spoke, the air around him turned heavy with resistance. His people scoffed at him, laughed at him, and called him a liar. The leaders, afraid of losing their influence, labeled him a dangerous threat. But he was undeterred, for he knew the path of a prophet was not paved with ease. The strength Allah gave him was unlike any other man of his time. His might was not only a gift, but a sign, a demonstration of divine support. There were times when his enemies tried to subdue him with force, but none could overpower him. He could face entire groups of men and emerge unbroken, for his power was not his own, but bestowed upon him by the Almighty. Stories of his strength spread far and wide, until even those who hated him could not deny that there was something extraordinary about him. To some, his might was an invitation to faith, a sign that Allah had favored him. To others, it was a challenge to their pride, a flame that burned their envy and pushed them to greater hatred. Yet even with his strength, Syamun never used it in arrogance. He was not a man who crushed others for personal gain. His power was always tempered with justice, guided by revelation, used only in defense of truth and in the struggle against oppression. His enemies often mocked him, saying, "If you are truly a prophet, then prove it with signs beyond your strength." And he would remind them that miracles alone could not guide the hearts of those who had already chosen blindness. The true miracle was the message itself, the call to worship Allah, which stood clear and undeniable. But their hearts were locked, sealed by arrogance and the lure of worldly desires. The more he spoke, the greater the hostility grew. The leaders held secret councils, whispering among themselves about how this prophet must be stopped. "If we allow him to continue," they said, "our idols will lose their worth, our temples will be abandoned, and our people will rebel against us." They tried mockery, then threats, and when neither silenced him, they turned to violence. Yet no matter what they did, Syamun's strength and faith allowed him to endure. For every insult hurled at him, he responded with patience. For every attack, he stood firm without fear. His very existence became a thorn in their side, a living testimony to their powerlessness against the truth. But even as his enemies raged, there were whispers among the common people. Some saw in him the light of truth, the dignity of a man who stood unshaken amid storms. A few believed in him quietly, afraid of persecution, but moved by the sincerity in his words. Still, the majority remained bound by their idols, clinging to the traditions of their forefathers as if to abandon them would erase their very identity. For them, Syamun's message was an insult to everything they thought sacred. Among all of this chaos stood his wife, a woman who lived in his home, ate from his hands, and listened to his words daily. She witnessed the strength of his faith and the miracles of his might, and she lived under the roof of a prophet. Yet faith is not inherited through proximity, and the heart is not guided by being near to the guided. Within her was a weakness unseen by Simon, a softness that could be molded by whispers of temptation. Though she stood beside him outwardly, her loyalty was not as unshakable as he believed. For now she was silent, but in her silence lay the seeds of the greatest test he would ever face. Still, Syamun continued his mission with unwavering dedication. Every day he called his people to the worship of Allah, reminding them that life and death, power and weakness, all rested in the hands of the Creator. His voice echoed through gatherings, warning of punishment for those who defied, promising mercy for those who repented. But his warnings were dismissed as madness, and his promises were ridiculed as empty dreams. To his people, he was a man too stubborn to let go of his delusion. To himself, he was a servant fulfilling the command of his Lord. And so the battle between truth and falsehood intensified, a clash not of swords alone, but of hearts and beliefs. On one side stood a prophet with unmatched strength and a message of divine unity. On the other stood a nation bound by arrogance, driven by leaders who thrived on deception and an unseen betrayal brewing within his very home. What lay ahead for Syamun Al-Ghozi was a trial unlike any he had faced before, one that no strength of arm could overcome and no earthly defense could resist. For the enemy that threatened him most was not the one who brandished weapons, but the one who whispered in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. The strength of Syamun Al-Ghozi was unlike anything his people had ever witnessed. From the day Allah gifted him this might, it was clear he was not like other men. His body was firm and unyielding, his grip powerful enough to subdue the fiercest of enemies, and his endurance unmatched. Yet his strength was not meant for pride or for the mere display of dominance. It was a trust, a tool to protect the truth and to shield the weak. When enemies of the message tried to strike him down, they found themselves humiliated, unable to harm him no matter how many they sent. When tyrants raised their voices, Syamun's presence alone silenced them. For his reputation was that of a man whom no one could subdue. There were stories told of how he faced groups of armed men, yet emerged without a wound, as if the very hand of Allah was guarding him. His strength became a legend, one that terrified his enemies and gave hope to those few who quietly believed. To the people still bound to their idols, this was a paradox. How could a man who opposed their gods be so powerful? If their idols were truly divine, why did they not strip him of this might? The answer was clear, but they refused to acknowledge it. Instead of submitting to the truth, their envy grew. His strength became a symbol that undermined their falsehood, and so it became the very thing they sought to destroy. Simon, however, carried his power with humility. He never used it to glorify himself or to oppress others. When he was attacked, he defended himself, but he never became the aggressor. His strength was a sign, and he used it to remind his people of Allah's greatness, saying that if a single man could be granted such might, What then of the Creator who gave it? But their hearts were sealed. To them, Syamun's strength was a threat to their pride and a constant reminder of their weakness. And so they began to whisper among themselves, plotting in secret, seeking a way to bring him down that did not rely on force, for force had already failed them. The leaders, desperate and humiliated, sought to exploit what they believed every man must have, a weakness. They studied Syamun from afar, searching for cracks in his armor, a moment of vulnerability that could be exploited. In battle, he was invincible. In faith, he was immovable. But like any man, he had a home, a family, a private life unseen by the public eye. And in that private life was a wife whose heart did not mirror his. To Syamun, she was a companion, a partner in life, a source of trust and comfort. To his enemies, she became a potential doorway into his downfall. She was a woman who lived under the roof of a prophet, who ate from his hand and listened to his words daily. She saw miracles unfold before her eyes, and she heard the words of guidance more often than anyone else. Yet her heart was not steady in faith. The glamour of wealth, the promise of luxury, the temptation of worldly gain, they all whispered to her, feeding a secret desire she never confessed. Perhaps she envied the attention her husband received. Perhaps she was wearied by the constant hostility surrounding their lives. Or perhaps she simply longed for comforts her heart clung to. Whatever her reason, it was enough to make her vulnerable to the whispers of those who sought to use her. The leaders knew this and approached her in secrecy. They spoke with honeyed words, not threats. They promised wealth beyond her imagination, gifts of gold and jewels, a life free of fear and hardship. They painted pictures of a future where she would no longer live in the shadow of a prophet, no longer suffer the burdens of his mission. At first, she resisted. She remembered the strength of her husband, his devotion, his love. But greed is a seed that once planted begins to grow silently. With each meeting, with each whispered promise, her resolve weakened. The enemies of Syamun knew this well and pressed further, asking her about her husband's strength, about the source of his might. For the truth was that Syamun's power was not limitless in the way they imagined. Like every gift, it came with a condition known only to him and those closest to him. It was a secret that, if revealed, could strip him of his protection and leave him vulnerable. His enemies could never discover it by force, for no torture or questioning could break him. But his wife, who lived closest to him, was the only one who could betray such knowledge. And in her growing weakness, they saw their opportunity. The moment of betrayal did not come suddenly, but in gradual steps. She began to question him subtly, asking about his strength, pretending to marvel at his might, seeking to learn what truly sustained it. Syamun, blinded by trust, never imagined that such questions could be dangerous. In his innocence, he revealed what should have remained hidden. Perhaps he thought her curiosity harmless. Perhaps he believed her loyalty unshakable. Whatever the reason, he spoke, and with his words, the seed of betrayal was complete. His enemies waited patiently. When the time came, she delivered the secret to them, exchanging the trust of her husband for the glitter of gold and the fleeting comfort of promises. To them, it was the key they had long sought, the weakness they could finally exploit. To her, it was a step that once taken could never be undone. In her hands lay the fate of a prophet, and she chose betrayal. From that moment on, the path of Syamun Al-Ghozi began to change. He remained unaware at first, continuing his mission, still facing his people with the same unwavering courage. But behind the scenes, his enemies prepared, armed not with swords or spears, but with knowledge, a knowledge that could topple a man whose strength had once seemed untouchable. And as the conspiracy grew in secret, Syamun walked unknowingly toward the greatest trial of his life, a trial that no strength of arm could protect him from, for it came not from his enemies in battle, but from the very heart of the one he trusted most. The day of betrayal did not begin with thunder or storm, but with silence. The enemies of Syamun Al-Ghozi had waited long enough, their hearts burning with vengeance, their minds sharpened with a single purpose: to bring down the prophet whose strength had humbled them for so long. They no longer feared his might, for they held the secret that had once been hidden within his household, the very secret that gave his strength form. It was in their hands now, delivered by the woman he trusted most, the woman who shared his bed and knew his heart. With this secret, they prepared their ambush. Syamun himself was unaware. To him, life continued as it always had. He rose, prayed, called his people to faith, and stood tall against the arrogance of their leaders. He felt no weakness in his limbs, no trembling in his voice. But the betrayal that awaited him was not physical, it was strategic. His enemies had planned the exact moment to strike, a time when he would least expect it, and when the secret knowledge of his strength could be used to bind him. It happened at night, when the world was quiet and the stars shimmered above the land. His enemies moved in silence, surrounding his dwelling. They were many, armed and prepared, not with courage, but with the certainty that their victory had already been assured by the treachery of his wife. When they broke into his home, Syamun rose with the power of a man ready to defend himself, his eyes blazing with the fire of resistance. Many times before, groups had come to seize him, and each time they had been humiliated. But this time was different. As he reached for his strength, he felt it falter. What had always surged through his body like a river now felt distant, diminished. He grasped at the power that once made him invincible, but his arms felt heavier, his body weaker. In that instant, he knew something had changed, something had been taken from him. And though his enemies trembled for a moment, expecting the old Syamun to crush them, they soon realized the truth. The secret they had been given was true. He was vulnerable. They rushed him, chains in hand, weapons raised, and for the first time in his life, Syamun could not resist them. He struggled, fought with all he had left, but the strength that once made him untouchable was no longer his. They struck him down, bound his arms, and dragged him out as though he were no more than a common man. The humiliation burned deeper than the wounds inflicted upon him, for this was not a defeat in battle, but a betrayal of trust. He looked for his wife, but she did not meet his eyes. Her silence confirmed what his heart already knew. The betrayal had come from her. The people awoke to the sight of their prophet in chains. The man they had feared, mocked, or secretly admired was now dragged through the streets like a captured beast. His enemies paraded him before the idols he had condemned, declaring to the people that their gods had triumphed over him. Some shouted with joy, convinced that the false gods had proven their power. Others watched in silence, their hearts breaking, unable to reconcile the sight of a prophet humiliated. Among them were those who had believed in him, now forced to see their leader disgraced. For Syamun, the humiliation was heavy, but heavier still was the weight in his heart. He had never feared death nor suffering, but betrayal cut deeper than any sword. To be delivered into the hands of his enemies by the one closest to him was a wound that went beyond flesh and bone. As they dragged him before their leaders, mocked him, and struck him, he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the sky, for he knew that even in his fall, Allah's will was unfolding. His captors devised ways to break him further. They beat him, chained him, and forced him to endure humiliation day after day. They wanted not only to defeat him, but to destroy the symbol he had become. The once mighty prophet, the man who had been untouchable, was now caged, weakened, and mocked. They jeered at him, saying, "Where is your strength now, O Syamun? Where is the God you called us to worship?" Their laughter filled the air, but Syamun did not respond with anger. His silence itself was a statement, for he knew that Allah's wisdom extended beyond their shallow mockery. The fall of Syamun was not only the story of a man betrayed, but the story of how a community celebrated the downfall of their warner. They did not realize that in mocking him, they were sealing their own fate. His suffering was a test, one that carried lessons for those who had the eyes to see. But most were blind, and in their blindness, they rejoiced as though truth itself had been defeated. For Syamun, every moment of his captivity was a reminder of the fragility of human bonds. Trust in man could shatter. Love could turn to betrayal, but trust in Allah never wavered. Though his body was bound, his spirit remained free. The pain of betrayal was great, yet it only drew him closer to the certainty that nothing in this world is permanent except the decree of Allah. As days turned into weeks, the image of Syamun chained and broken became a spectacle. His enemies boasted that they had destroyed the prophet. They believed that his humiliation was proof of their God's strength and their own power. Yet beneath the surface there was an unease. Some began to wonder, how could a man once so mighty fall in such a way? Was it truly their idols that defeated him? Or was this too part of something greater? The story of Syamun's fall was not the end of his legacy, for prophets are not measured by worldly triumphs. Their mission is not to secure comfort for themselves, but to fulfill the command of Allah, no matter the cost. And so even in chains, even in betrayal, Syamun remained a prophet, his story turning into a lesson that would echo through generations. That strength is nothing without obedience, that betrayal can come from the closest of hearts, and that the plan of Allah is always greater than the schemes of men.